everyone. Welcome back to Janus Academy. This is our historical analogies list of lectures. Today we're talking about the 20th in our series. This is going to be dedicated to Surrealism and to lowbrow art. This is an interesting one. The one that I kind of struggled to decide to do it because it seems like a very obvious analogy, and it seems like reinventing hot water, basically, in many different ways. So it was a bit of a struggle, but ultimately I decided to do it. Now, why am I saying this? If you think about lowbrow art, one of the appellations for it is pop surrealism, and you can really use these synonymously. They're both equally valid. I think I prefer lowbrow a bit better. I'm going to explain why in a minute. But yeah, it's a bit of an obvious analogy to be talking about connection between surrealism and pop surrealism, because in both cases we are talking about surrealism. I do think this is an interesting one to explore, and I do think it has a lot of sense to talk about them. Now, it's following this generally well-established trajectory that whatever was happening in the beginning of the 20th century and whatever was connected one way or the other to colonialism and World War I then started happening again in its neo phase after World War II in the second half of the 20th century. So you could say that, we had Expressionism, then we had New Expressionism. We had Surrealism, then we had Pop Surrealism. We've had abstract art, then we had different forms of abstract art like abstract Expressionism, lyrical expressionism, and many other things. So this is going to be following that preset pattern, but of course in its own very peculiar way. Now, another thing I want to address, and this is less important, but I'm still going to say it, is that I find this analogy interesting because I don't really like surrealism that much, personally. This is, of course, a very subjective statement, and I don't want to give it, absolute meaning. But yeah, the fact is that I don't really like surrealism, almost at all. Whereas I absolutely love pop surrealism. I absolutely love lowbrow art. To me, that's one of the most fascinating, most engaging, most inspired, and again, subjectively, most cherished, closest to my heart, if you will, stylistical formations of the 20th century. I just love this style with the passion. And I love the artists that acted inside it. I love their aesthetics. I love their sense of humor, their plasticity. This is just very close to me personally. Another thing that we're going to be addressing is a historical analogy, but in a triple form, not just double as we're usually doing it, because we need to remember the previous analogy that we were discussing when we spoke of surrealism, and this was its connection to medieval period and all things medieval. So we shall be also addressing in introduction, if nothing else, the connection between these two, the connection that we have between medieval period in general, Gothic style, Gothic revival style, the connection it has to surrealism, and then the connection it also has to pop surrealism and lowbrow. Now, I want to address this. So when we say pop surrealism, what does it mean? We can really interpret it in two different manners, and I think it's important to address both. So one of them would basically be about the connection lowbrow art has to pop art, and pop art is its whole thing. We're going to be talking about that, of course, in one of the sequent lectures. It's something that happens along roughly in the same time, so I gave it a bit of a thought which one of these I was going to address first. Ultimately it doesn't really matter because they're contemporary for a large part of it. Pop art may be actually a bit older, but once we get to that lecture, you'll understand why I decided to place it by the end of the entire series. So yeah, we can say pop surrealism because it deals with pop art, but also, and I would argue more importantly, it deals with popular culture, with pop culture, with everything that has to do with mass media culture that is available to everyone. And there's the distinction to be made here that many art historians and theoreticians absolutely abhor and refuse, with good reasons, the distinction between high culture and low culture. What's been going on since Romanticism began, more or less, really, is this blend between the two, and the fact that we start to lose a hard border between the two. So they come together in many different ways. I say this has been going on since basically late 18th century, so it's nothing new, but it's ongoing, and every time it reaches a new step, every time it goes over a certain threshold, we act incredibly surprised and, oh my God. Is it possible for street art to be considered a legitimate art? Is it possible for art to be vulgar and mundane and banal? Is it possible for art to be considered legitimately art with a capital A, and to be dealing with something that is base and everyday? And the answer, of course, is yes. It has been that way for a very long time. Still, people are surprised in a very cyclical manner that this is so. So when we're talking about lowbrow, the very appellation tells you that its ambition, its context, its, how should I say, birthing ground, its cradle, if you will, is in mundane popular culture. And of course, it has a lot to do with the work of Frankfurt School. This is something we want to address, and we're going to probably address it later. This idea, we already mentioned a couple of times, that popular culture and popular art, so not pop art, but just popular culture more broadly that is communicated through mass media, is the most important ideological battlefield of the moment. And this is something that Frankfurt School thinkers insisted upon. I think they had a point. I think they were right for most of it. So people like Adorno and Horkheimer and Marcuse, to a certain extent, insisted that this really was the most important domain of action of today. But today, you know, from 60s to basically today. And that we should be focusing on this field rather than on the field of high culture, I mean air quotes, times 10, because this is something that concerns a lot more people. This is something that's available to a lot more people, and in a system that is democratic or pretends to be democratic, not to get into that, this is something that is really important because of sheer mass. You could say that the percentage of people that go to museums is far less than percentage of people who own television sets or who watch TV or nowadays who browse the internet. Let's say the internet didn't exist in the, well, it kind of did exist in the 60s, but it wasn't globally available anyhow. It wasn't an incredibly important channel of communication as it is today. You could say that, yes, a lot more people indulge in popular culture than people that indulge in high culture. And this is something that is just a given fact. And this is something that populist artists or populist politicians, if you will, like to underline because it is really important. It engages a lot more people. It tells us that the art that decides to be this way and decides to situate itself in this field is inherently anti-elitist. And this is a very important thing. The most important thing, really, when we're talking about surrealism on one end and then pop surrealism that is lowbrow on the other. Now, there's a difference to be made, and of course we're going to make it between things that are common and broad and have a broad appeal and things that are vulgar and base and very often offensive. Lowbrow obviously situates itself with both of these, but more strongly with the latter, because the term lowbrow doesn't necessarily mean popular. It rather means vulgar. If we are making a distinction between highbrow and lowbrow, it means something that is decidedly not polished, not elegant, not sophisticated. It's quite the opposite. So lowbrow has this very strong popular and populist appeal, but it also has this character of embracing whatever it is that's on the other side of politeness. So it really seeks to affirm this particular class of people, this particular culture. Now, you could say that it has a lot to do with, of course, the world as it was. Surrealism was happening on the brinks of World War I, and it was deeply influenced by Dada movement that, as we know, came as a direct reaction on World War I. It was this attempt to seek superior reality, as we know. And you could argue the same thing with pop surrealism, I mean, as the name suggests. Now, the interesting thing is that original surrealism dealt with a lot of common things, with a lot of common objects. It dealt with objects that were a part of industrial production. And we know, of course, not to go through the whole thing again, what Marcel Duchamp did with many of his artworks. I'm going to put some of them to go as I'm talking about this. So he basically infused ordinary objects with artistic appeal, with substance, with artistic value. Objects as plain and ordinary as the urinal, very famous. So you could say that what pop surrealists were doing was exactly the same thing, though they would have objects of mass production that was far more important, I would argue, after World War II than during and after World War I. And it was far more important also because of a different economical and ideological model that was adopted that had to do with Keynesian economy, that had to do with this idea of abundance that suddenly was seemingly, and if we limit our perspective on the first world, available to everyone. Now, of course, it wasn't available to everyone. Yeah, not to get into that. But this was the impression that was given. This was the image that was generated, that we live in the world that is such that you can, again, live off of one minimum wage. You can have a family, you can own a house, all these things that are difficult to imagine nowadays. And of course, not that it was easy back in the day, but it seemed possible. There was this general atmosphere of optimism. And there was this general idea of hyperproduction of industrial goods and of hyperconsumption on the other end of industrial goods that made this possible. So there was this veritable inundation of the market and of culture and of daily lives with stuff. So you could say that stuff was a bit different than stuff that original surrealists were dealing with. You could say that while most of the objects that Marcel Duchamp and any other surrealists that were working with back in the day were still made of, I would say, industrial materials of certain quality. They were still made of ceramics or porcelain even, or wood and metal and whatnot. Whereas most of the objects that lowbrow artists are dealing with, either creating sculptures or creating installations or creating paintings that feature such objects, most of those are made of plastic. And this is a very interesting thing. This is a very different thing, because plastic, as we know, is not organic. I mean, it kind of is, because it's made from petroleum, which comes from dinosaur fossil remnants, which comes from, dinosaur carcasses and many other different animals' carcasses. So you could say that ultimately it is kind of organic, but not really. It's not really, it's highly industrially, how should I say, processed, yes. And when you think about plastic, you think about industrial processing, you think about something that is unnatural. So we could say that this whole idea of art being separated from nature and art separating from nature, and this great dichotomy of culture and nature acting here, it goes one step further. It goes simply in a bigger direction, because in a more definitive manner it goes in this direction, because plastic is something that is generally broadly available, that is cheap, that is seen as of lower quality. If you think about an object that's made of wood or metal and plastic, you will not say that the greatest quality of those three is the plastic one. Of course, there are exceptions, but I'm talking about it in very general terms. If you have, let's say, a watch that's made of plastic, it's not going to be seen quite the same as a watch that's made of metal. So you get the point. So there's this whole idea that art is moving into this direction. It's moving more and more towards everyday, mundane, consumerist, towards more and more banal. Whereas the original surrealism still stayed with materials that were considered to be of higher quality. It stayed with glass and metal and wood rather than plastic. And now I want to talk about another very important connection between these two that is a bit of a difference rather than similarity, but I think it's really important to bring forth because they come as a reaction to slightly different affairs, and it has to do with technicality and technicity of work. It really has to do with technical quality, technical properties of work. So one of the main features of surrealism that, again, was heavily influenced by Dada was letting technique aside a little bit. Now, I know that some painters would be gravely offended if they were alive to hear me, but this is just the case. These were not necessarily best made paintings in the world, especially if we think about the period where neoclassical painting was still alive. We are talking about the beginning of the 20th century, so there's still a lot of neoclassical painters that are around and that create paintings that are phenomenally well made, purely technically speaking. So surrealism wasn't really top-notch technique, whereas pop surrealism, strangely enough, and in complete contrast to what we just said, that it goes further and further towards banal, is technically marvelous. It's really something that they cherish and nurture, and they're very proud of. Now, when it comes to pop surrealism, lowbrow, it comes to the fact that for a major part of it, this is a reaction against conceptual art. And this is a very, I would say, visceral reaction. It's basically a disagreement with this idea that art has completely left the domain of technicality, of matter, of talent, if you will. The very basic fact that if you want to draw, if you want to paint, we generally think, we assume that you have to have some talent for it. You have to have some skill that is innate, that you are born with or you are not. We have this idea that art necessitates this particular feature to be present in the persona of the artist. And this is simply not the case with conceptual art. And many criticisms that you will hear of conceptual art is that people who don't know how to draw and people who don't know how to paint deal with conceptual art. Of course, this is not necessarily true. But what I'm saying is that these are the artists who seek to reclaim skill. They seek to reclaim talent, and they seek to say, no, art is all about talent. Look what amazing painters we are. Look at how incredibly skilled we are. Look at all these complex compositions, these masterful anatomical distortions, these brave stylizations that we can do. So it's a very interesting mixture of, thematically speaking, banal, offensive, and vulgar art that situates itself in the most superficial layer of popular culture, and technical prowess that is indeed at times, Renaissance level. So it is really interesting as a mixture, because if you're talking about Renaissance art, you say, okay, technique is impeccable, though again, I would argue not quite comparable to medieval, but yeah, let's leave that aside. And themes and topics that are also quite elevated. Now, actually, when I think about this was a terrible example, because Renaissance is really when we begin using banal things like portraits of regular people who are not even aristocratic, but are just bourgeois and very wealthy. Yeah, if you're talking about medieval art, let's say this is a good example. You have phenomenal technique, masterful technique, paintings that are incredibly well made, and to this day they stay impeccable. And a topic that is really there with technique in terms of importance, in terms of how elevated it is. It's this whole idea that you will represent the most important collection of stories that we have in the Western culture, at least. So we're talking about the Bible and a lot of biblical scenes and a lot of what is considered a holy story, a holy narrative, a set of holy narratives, rather, and the sacred history of Israel that deals with the Old Testament. So we're talking about the most important of topics that is then treated with the finest of techniques that we have available at that particular period. And then the two come together. Then if we're talking about, let's say, Impressionism on the other end, it's also thematically coherent because you have banal topics that are treated with lackluster technique. We already explained this. I love Impressionism, by the way. This is not a value judgment. This is just a given fact that technically speaking, these paintings were not well made with a specific reason. Now, when you're talking about lowbrow art, you have this strange mismatching that you have phenomenal technique almost all over the board, across the board. All of the painters who partake in this, all of the sculptors that partake in this are almost unanimously incredibly technically savvy and skilled. So we have this situation where you have most banal of topics that are intentionally offensive, rather, to snobbish or ambitious or highbrow sensibilities. And we have amazing technique that was achieved, that was used to depict something that is, again, offensively banal. Now, I want to inspect this because I find this to be really interesting. I think that this is a very important point about pop surrealism, and something that connects it to original surrealism, but also to a certain extent removes it from it. And I want to address this idea that original surrealists had, that they would use everyday banal objects in their work, they would depict them, they would infuse them with meaning that goes beyond their everyday use. It has a lot to do with how you see an object in representative painting, or even a person, it really doesn't matter. It has to do with what it stands for, what it means, what it represents. Now, we have this idea when it comes to symbols or allegories or any other vehicles of meaning that we can see in a painting or in a statue, that the older they are, the better they are, the more substance they have. And we tend to think that an object that has this archetypal ancient presence and value is somehow more elevated, more original, more valuable than something that is contemporary and whose usage is limited. So you could say that, for example, if you have a telephone presented on your painting, we had a lot of those, or famously you have Rene Magritte's pipe on a painting. This is not something that can compare to, let's say, the tree of life, a very famous archetypical symbol, or just rather an archetype, or a cave, or let's say a sword or a cup. These ritualistic objects or items that have deep roots and very deep elaborate meaning. They've been around so long that we've been infusing meaning into these objects since time immemorial, so it seems. So this cannot compare to, let's say, a plastic cup or a plastic doll or something of that order. You understand the point. Now, this is exactly what surrealists are trying to do and what pop surrealists are trying to do. They're taking these objects that are completely banal, that are made for ephemeral, everyday use, whose lifespan is not terribly long. Like, again, a plastic cup, you use it, for like 10 minutes, then you discard it, then you don't think about it, then it becomes trash. So it's this idea that you take these objects, everyday banal objects, and you infuse them with all the meaning and all the symbolism and all the substantial potency as you would in these ritualistic sacred objects of yore. And this is an incredibly ambitious endeavor if you think about it. So when original surrealists are painting banal things, everyday things, things of everyday usage, they seek to infuse it with meaning. And they seek to infuse it with substance. So lowbrow artists are doing the same thing. But what is interesting is that they're using really not only everyday objects, but they're using specifically objects that tend to be advertised a lot. Objects that are not only present in our daily lives, but are present in mass media, that are present in propaganda on a very large level. So you will see that dolls play a key point and a key part in lowbrow art. You will see a lot of dolls present with many different artists. People like Jason Freeney, for example, whose entire career is deconstructing dolls, or rather depicting interior of dolls, depicting skeletons and, well, just what you would see if you were to take the skin of the doll away. You have the whole Kenny Scharf approach to things. You have, of course, my personal favorite, Mark Ryden. And his entire aesthetic is informed by dolls, especially Barbie dolls. He has a fixation on Barbie dolls for some reason. So it's this whole idea of what a doll is. It has to do with infancy, it has to do with childhood, but it also has to do with consumerism, because we tend to buy a lot of toys for our kids, and kids are an incredibly important section of the market, adolescents as well as children. And it's this very interesting idea that brings us back to original surrealism that was heavily influenced, of course, by Freud and his theories and the whole notion of subconsciousness. We already covered this. It has to do with childhood. So if you're thinking about childhood, according to Freud and many other psychologists and psychoanalysts, childhood is when we form our entire character. The first 4 years are supposed to be the most formative in genesis of our entire being. And this is when everything that will make us into a person later comes together. And this is most heavily connected with id. You know that Freud divided the human being into three separate uh, entities, or rather layers. You could say layers, aspects. Let's put it that way: id, ego, and superego. Childhood is closest related to id, and it's what's most fundamental. It's also closest to subconsciousness. It's the most spontaneous part of our existence. So children are said to be much more honest than adults, and you get the point. So it's a very interesting take that these people, lowbrow artists, take a keen, I would say, approach and a very keen interest into dolls, because of course dolls are connected to children, but it's as if we are approaching childhood, and we're approaching all of those things that we've just mentioned about formation of the human persona and formation of your being, and the time when you're most honest but also most vulnerable, the time when you need most protection, etc., etc. So they're connecting this entire context with consumerism and with the market and with advertisement and with mass culture that is bombarding us, well, with ads, essentially. And when they're dealing with toys, it's as if they're saying childhood in its entirety has been commodified in this particular era that we're living in. It's been inundated with plastic again. And we have this inundation of stuff imposed upon us since our earliest, most tender age. And this is why you see a lot of these artists deconstructing these dolls in a very humorous ways. This is the whole thing about Jason Freeney, is that he depicts them as skeletons. He takes an interest in their anatomy. He basically depicts the inside. Now, as a child, you don't really care about inside, about anatomy of your doll. You don't think about its bones or muscles or nervous system or interior organs. It's just not, you're not interested in that, let's put it that way. And it's as if he's saying, let's see what's behind. Let's see what's behind this unhealthy obsession with dolls and with toys that we have. And this, of course, especially has to do with America, United States of America. It has to do with consumerism in America. America was, and I think officially still is, we're talking about this in March of 2025, the most industrialized country in the world, the most industrial economic power of the world for the moment. And of course, it as such, it deals with production as well as consumption. Now, you could argue that production has been misplaced in a systematic manner from the 70s and onwards to the countries of the third world. So America proper does not deal with production quite as much, but it still deals with consumption very much. And these artists are addressing consumption rather than production. They're addressing this end of the entire story. And they are addressing this whole inundation of the most tender age of our existence with consumerism. So this is what's happening here. Now, when you're looking at Mark Ryden's paintings, you're looking at this very oniric, twisted, incredibly humorous at the same time universe, I would say. We could definitely use this term, that is mostly informed, that is mostly influenced by this particular take on things, that it's all about toys and dolls, Barbie dolls, and the spiritual potency of those. He has a lot of paintings where Barbies are presented in Christic poses, Barbie Virgin Mary, and all of it. So he is talking about pop, if you will, spirituality, trash spirituality. I think this is not inaccurate. And he is talking about a very interesting thing here. All of these other people too, Robert Williams generally, and yeah, a lot of other ones. Now, what is this all about? It takes us back to original surrealism. It takes us back to why is this analogy so incredibly interesting, is this whole idea that we do not seek to separate spirit from matter anymore in quite the same manner. We actually seek to bring them together. So it's this ancient and, again, medieval problem of spirit versus matter, soul versus body, where you seek to bring them together. Like, let's say, like in the interior of a Gothic church or a cathedral, you see them coming together through adversity, through conflict, but still present in the same place. This art has a very similar ambition. Surrealism had a very similar ambition. So they see the world of matter profoundly changed through the industrial process. And again, industrial process around World War I and the industrial process around and after World War II. They see the realm of matter profoundly changed, and then they seek to reach spirit through what is matter. They seek to reach spirit is specifically through matter that is everyday in nature, that is banal, vulgar, and offensive. So this is not just matter. Let's say human body has material presence, and it can be beautiful, it can be glorious, it can be fascinating. No, they specifically choose things that are industrially made and things that are seen as everyday, seen as quotidian and banal. I'm overusing this term, but I don't know enough adequate synonyms for it, because it has a lot to do with core values of these two movements. The thing is that surrealists sought to reach superior reality, because surrealism, of course, is above reality. It's above realism. And this is the distinction I want to make, that if we're talking about réalisme, art that is realism, in French réalisme, and then we're talking about surréalisme, we are talking about a very similar ambition. So you're dealing with reality in one end, and then you're dealing with superior reality on the other. Now, why am I saying this? Because I want to make a distinction between realism and reality. So realism as an artistic, stylistical formation, artistic movement, stylistical formation, that has to do with how you represent things, and even more importantly, with how you treat topics, which topics you choose, which themes you choose. So this is an approach to how you depict things and which topics you choose. And then reality as such, reality really as a philosophical category, if you will. And when we're talking about surrealism, we're talking about two of these things at the same time. We're talking about the technique you use, the style you use, but also we're talking about addressing reality, really what it is. I mean, as a philosophical and to a lesser extent, I would say, aesthetical question. When we are dealing with lowbrow pop surrealism, we are dealing with the same question. So they are approaching reality. They want to understand reality on a deeper and on a higher level, because this is what they seek. The very title, the very appellation of their movement states pop surrealism. So it's basically pop superior reality. We have to understand it as such. Not just realism as a method, as a technique, as a stylistical formation. No, inquiry into reality as a philosophical category. So we have both of these coming together. And we have this attitude that surrealists had, that it is through everyday banality, through industrial way of life, through industrial existence, that we get to the profundity of our being, and then we go up, much like Dante has done in his descent through Inferno, and then up through purgatory and up through different stages of paradise. But also we do the same thing with pop surrealism. So we go down into the most banal spheres and stratas of popular culture. We consume what is most banal, what is most offensive and trashy, so that we could achieve superior understanding, so that we could get ourselves to superior, not only realism, but indeed reality. And this is an interesting thing. You could say that it's humorous, that it's ironic, that it's cynical. But I think it makes a very strong point that is completely valid and legitimate. I think it makes a very strong point that if you situate this art where it came from, which is basically late 60s, early 70s Los Angeles, and generally speaking, the west coast of America, it makes a lot of sense. You think about Los Angeles as the very heart of American media scene. It's the place where Hollywood is. That's where they make movies. Later, it also became the place where they make most video games, where porn industry is. So it's just very much where a lot of television also is. So it's just a place where they produce most media from, geographically speaking. And it makes a lot of sense that this type of art would come from that same place, and that it would deal with media. And then you can have a whole line of inquiry, which we'll just very briefly, superficially, and partially do. if you think about Baudrillard's philosophy, and if you think about this connection between reality and representation, if you think about simulacra and simulation, if you think about his attitude that we live in a simulation of reality, that we live in a copy of a copy of a copy, and then you can add as many copies as you want of reality, of something that is truly significant and filled with substance. Now, this is exactly what these people are dealing with. They're dealing with this whole idea that their landscape is filled with plastic. It's filled with something that is, by definition, how should I say, artificial and false in a certain way. That doesn't really represent the truth. You can say that a lot of these artists, again, they paint and sculpt dolls, and we know dolls are, by definition, by design, artificially made. Even if it's the most sophisticated doll that you can imagine, even if it approaches the status of a statue, or it is a statue, it's still artificially made. And there is something fundamentally different in representing something that is already made, something that is already a representation, and representing an actual human being or an animal or something that has authentic existence. And this is exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about Baudrillard's take on copies of things. It goes back to Plato and his idea of rings, magnetic rings that he exposes in Ion, his famous dialogue. It's that there is this initial inspiration that comes from the realm of forms, and then a poet, let's say that's writing a poem, is inspired directly by muses that come from the realm of forms. So, or Plato doesn't really address his muses. So he just says inspiration comes from forms directly. Poet gets inspired, then person who recites his poem gets inspired, then the person who listens to the poem being recited gets inspired, and we have this like magnetic chain that is this magnetic energy that is communicated through different metal rings that attach to one another. And of course, the further you go down that chain, the magnetic connection becomes weaker and weaker. And so these people, pop surrealists, are operating in a world where this chain is incredibly long and the signal is very weak at the end, but still they seek to cross this very long and very complicated multifaceted bridge so as to get to the essence. And their starting position is very far removed as compared to the starting position of, let's say, original surrealists or some other people, let's say people acting in medieval context. And again, it has to do with plastic and it has to do with artifice. It has to do with the fact that they represent already artificial things. And in very few cases, they represent actual entities. Now, you can see this present in many different ways. If you're looking at different people and different aesthetics, you can address Robert Williams. He's a very interesting artist. And he's someone who situates his art, again, in the realm of artificial, but who is also very much connected to pop culture, again, popular culture. Now, one of his most famous works was a cover design for a hard rock band, you could say hard rock, I guess, Guns N' Roses. And yeah, this is for their album Appetite for Destruction. This cover was seen as scandalous and not adequate, so they forced another cover. They've placed his illustration on the interior, not on the front. And yeah, I'll put his work so as to illustrate the point. And you see what he represents is a robot that looks like he is about to rape a person that's in front of them. So it's very sexually explicit. It hints at gravest of sexual offenses. It's very violent, and again, it's very vulgar. It's very in your face, which is again another important aspect of his work and of lowbrow in general. But it really speaks of something artificial. Again, robot is an artificial entity, and it speaks with this relationship between an actual human and a robot. This is a very important topic. If you look at other paintings Robert Williams has done, you can see that he is absolutely fascinated by cars. Cars are featured in his paintings in a very important manner. It's a leitmotif, really, of what he does. And you can see that on the other end, he is kind of obsessed with Americana, and especially a type of Americana that has to do with the West, that has to do with the desert and cowboys and horses and horse riding and all that thing. So it's like this whole analogy between horses and cars, and how a car is a contemporary modern horse, and how we grow a relationship with cars as we did with horses back in the day, and how we love machines like we loved animals. So we have these artificial entities that we take care of rather than actual living beings with soulful presence, if not spiritual, but soulful. So it deals with that whole thing, and of course it does it in a very skillful and I would say articulate manner. He does it also with a lot of talent. And we kind of see this whole fascination with mechanics. We see this whole fascination with the relation between the mechanical and the organic, the artificial and raw and rawly human. And we can see how important industrial motor production is for this type of aesthetics. So this is something that brings us back to the original Surrealism and just how important industrial motor production was for them. We remember the whole automatic writing or automatic painting, the whole process of creation that they saw as automatic by design. And of course, this can only be in the industrial context. And I think it's a really important thing to address all of this because it addresses another very important aspect, and that is violence and gore of popular culture. If you think about popular culture, especially in America, I mean, to this day, really, from 60s to this day, it didn't change that much. It's filled with violence, and it's filled with a very peculiar type of violence. Now, this is something that is a trend in Hollywood films. I wouldn't say more and more so. It has kind of been that way from the very beginning. It's this very weird, very perverse saccharization of violence. It's basically making violence acceptable. It's aestheticizing violence in a very curious manner. So you could say that, for example, Western films were incredibly popular, fundamental aspect of cinema. My PhD happens to have been in Western and partisan films, so I've studied them a lot. And you know, on one end, you could say that Western films were, well, about violence. In many cases, you have gunslingers one way or the other. You have people shooting at one another, people killing one another in many Western movies. Something that doesn't really have to do, or doesn't really, historically speaking, didn't have that much to do with cowboys, because cowboys were people who dealt with cattle. Not all of them were armed. In fact, most of them weren't. And it has to do with this idea that when you're looking at Westerns, you're looking at the tremendous amount of films or TV series especially that were explicitly made for kids. And that this was a genre that was very popular with kids. And that they made a lot of cowboy dolls and whatnot. I mean, you have a famous Toy Story series that the main character is a doll that's a cowboy. So we have this very weird situation where we're selling violence to children. And again, if we go back to what the child is and what childhood is, it's supposed to be the period of your life where you're most vulnerable, when you're not supposed to be exposed to violence really at all, but this is what it is. And we expose children to violence in a very systematic manner. There's a whole story that can be made, and perhaps we'll get to it eventually, how famously Disney sells sex to children. And it basically aestheticizes sex and makes it sort of, but not really, but kind of acceptable for children. And really, that's a very dark rabbit hole. not to get into it right now. But yeah, this is the whole thing, is that what Hollywood is doing is that it's representing violence as child-friendly. And we know that's not entirely right. That's not something that's supposed to be happening. I mean, even in societies that were incredibly violent and that were entirely focused on violence, like let's say Sparta in antiquity, they would try to spare children up until the age of 6 or 7. That's when that is when their military training would begin, but not before that. Whereas if you're looking at a lot of Hollywood production and a lot of, again, Disney production, it aims, it hits kids with violence in an even more tender age. What I'm getting to with this is what is really important for us to properly understand Jason Freeney's aesthetics, and why is it that he's making these dolls, and why is it he's stripping these dolls of layers of their skin, and he's depicting these dolls in a very surgical manner, I would say, really. He's looking at them as a surgeon would, and he is basically depicting their organs and their bones and all of these things. So it's, if you think about it, it's a violent sight just to see a human body opened up. If it's outside of the context of the operational room, I mean, even inside that context, it's a violent thing. And just to present it as a work of art invokes a lot of violence. But then he brings this together with, well, toys that, again, have to do with children and childhood. So it's a very weird situation. And this is exactly what he is dealing with. He wants to investigate pop culture and pop, not just pop art, but really pop culture. And he wants to go underneath the first strata of it, the most saccharine, the most acceptable, superficial strata, and he wants to go down into what it really is. So he wants to investigate violence and gore and uneasiness and everything that happens below the surface. So really the terror that lurks within. And of course, this has a very important political dimension. You can develop a lot of political statements out of it. And you can say the same thing about Robert Williams. And of course, you can say the same thing about Mark Ryden and many, many other people, especially Kenny Scharf. If you look at how he presents his work, and if you look at what kind of childhood would that assume, that's like a very nightmarish situation right there. And it's a Kafkian horror, if you will. So it's kind of like a pop, childish, eldritch horror, if you will. This is, I think, a good way to understand this. Now, when I say Kafkian, I want to address this in a bit greater detail. I want to make it a bit more understandable. It doesn't just deal with whatever we think the first when we think about Kafka, absurd and lapses of logic and the world that is turned upside down. Nightmarish, hellscapish administration. He doesn't necessarily think about those things. I mean, he does to a certain extent, but that's not the main point. When I say Kafkian, I'm referring mostly to how Kafka sees children. And this is a very interesting thing, because Kafka sees kids as absolute abominations. To him, children are the absolute worst. They're evil, they're corrupt, they're unruly, violent. They're really just the opposite of every kind of possible association you can have to a child. If you think that children are cute and are angelic and are pure and are innocent and all these other things, let's say Dostoevsky, he sees kids as such. Kafka sees them as complete opposite to all of that. And so when it comes to Kenny Scharf and his child pop aesthetics and cartoons and all of the other things, yeah, it's basically primordial horror. This is where it lurks from, and this is where it stands, and this is where it resides. And I think this is really funny. I mean, it's just incredibly humorous just by design, by default. Now, of course, you can understand how this would be connected to pop surrealism that is lowbrow. And then you can also kind of understand how it's connected to surrealism, the whole thing. And you can also bring it even further back. You can talk about how it's connected to the medieval context, which was the original analogy that we were addressing. How, you know, if you go back to the Bible and the New Testament, and what Jesus was saying is that we should all be like children, and the meek shall inherit the earth, and the kingdom of heaven belongs to children and childlike people. So you can deal with that whole thing. It's a very interesting line of reasoning to see how it develops and how it branches and how it reaches its complete opposites and all of it. Now, I want to address this, what I call Wonder Shows and aesthetics. I don't know if you're familiar with that show. It's something that ran in the early 2000s on MTV2. At least I saw it on MTV2 for the first time, and then I went through an effort of downloading all of the episodes and researching it in great detail. So this is probably the most evil thing that has ever been committed to screen, one way or the other. And I challenge everyone to claim otherwise. I'm not familiar with anything that was more perverse, twisted, depraved, and really downright horrible. Like if we're talking about, yeah, childish or childhood connected, childhood related eldritch horror. When I say eldritch horror, I'm referring to all things Lovecraftian and that particular that particular context. Yeah, I literally don't have any better references. I can't think of anything. Mr. Pickles kind of comes close, but not really. Yeah, so Wonder Chosen is heavily informed and heavily shaped by lowbrow aesthetics because it's kind of a spin-off of Sesame Street, but again, not really. It just takes that as a jumping point and it jumps into the void of absolute terror. And really, I mean, the first impression that I had of Wonder Chosen when I saw it on the screen in early 2000s, I was much younger then, was as if hell split open and burst forth into our own reality. I'm not exaggerating. This is really how I felt. It's like if you play the video game Diablo, that's what happens. You have like, Earth splits open and you can access hell directly. So yeah, I was looking at this slit, this pathway to hell. Wonder Chosen was this for me. And it's the first and I think the only time in my life where I felt this is too much. I cannot handle this. Like I'm literally wandering into something that I'm not equipped for. And yeah, I think this was a very good intuition. I think I was essentially right when I thought this. So we have this layer of pop surrealism, and it's even more evil and it's even more well debauched and twisted because it deals with children, because it's so heavily influenced by all things that have to do with childhood, that have to do with this particular approach. And then of course you can inspect and do your own research into how evil and depraved and downright perverse some people claim that the whole Disney machine is, and it has to do with something that started off as a media house that does phenomenally well-made cartoons that are made for kids but that are superbly artistically valuable, that are really the pinnacle of human creation at that particular moment, and then it just got further and further and more depraved. And you can argue that it was depraved from the very beginning. I mean, it's a whole thing, but it connects to what we're talking about fairly well. Of course, I'm not claiming this about Disney. This is my personal interpretation, whatever. But yeah, this is just, you can find a lot of criticism aimed at them, and you can find a lot of people who substantiate this much better, so you can do your own research on that. But the whole thing is that all of these things that we were addressing has strongly to do with political inclination of lowbrow art that goes back to political inclinations of surrealist movement, because it was heavily a left wing, you could say. It was very much against society as it was, meaning industrial capitalistic society. It had very strong communist inclinations. It was very much against the world as it was, especially during and after World War I, dealing with the aftermath of World War I. So political dimension is strongly present in lowbrow art too. It's a very sharp and poignant commentary on society that is obsessed with consumerism, and where consumer products basically become our reality. And they not only become our reality, our everyday life, but they become a pathway into superior reality. So this is a very interesting take, that even if we want to get to superior stratas of knowledge, of understanding, of existence, of experience, we have to start from plastic toys, from utter banality. And this is a very interesting take, again, on this medieval ambition to bring spirit and matter together, to fuse them together, rather. And yeah, it deals with something that is deeply artificial. Now, I want to also address another interesting aspect, and I hope we'll have the time for, because I see that the time is slowly running out. It's how we deal with imagination and what kind of imagination we have present in lowbrow movement. That again has to do with surrealism, and then behind it has to do strongly with all things medieval, with medieval context. It really connects itself to strange, surprising, and unexpected combinations, analogies, metaphors that are really edgy and really borderline, that we can see both in surrealist art and then furthermore in medieval illuminations marginalia. where you can find a lot of grotesque, twisted, deformed, sometimes humorously ugly creatures that are composites of many different other creatures, so the whole grotesque thing. And then you can talk about, sadly we don't have the time to, you can talk about grotesque as the way of looking at things, as a specific way of understanding the world. I hope to have an entire lecture dedicated to this as a part of a different series. Grotesque is really important in many different ways. And you have this whole idea of aestheticism of ugliness. Now, all of these things point to the core inspiration of lowbrow stylistical formation, where it steps perhaps a bit away from surrealism, but not in a terribly dramatic manner. It has a lot to do not only with popular and with populist, but really something that comes from the people, something that the German would address as folk. This idea that original, authentic art that is truly valuable always comes from the people. It's Chtonian in nature. It comes from the soil, if you will. And it's something that is opposed by its essence to all of the academia, all of the education, all of the sophistication. It's this idea that permeates the entirety of the 20th century, really, and a good chunk of the end of the 19th century, is that whatever is authentic, whatever is real and true and honest, really sits with the people, with the uneducated, with the illiterate, if you will. This is why primitive art is hailed as so important, why primitivism is such a big deal throughout the 20th century, really, not just the early 20th century. These guys have their own jab at this entire situation, and you can see this most clearly in Mark Ryden work. You can see that he deals with this particular aspect of folk art, of folk tales and legends and fairy tales and myths that the people perpetuate. This very dark and twisted and oniric and, well, this is kind of a poorly worded, but surrealist, if you will, aspect of mythical storytelling that has to do with everything that is perverse and Chtonian, really. But Chtonian in that deepest of senses. If you think about Tartarus as the very bottom of existence, and you think about abominations that reside there, the initial creation that was horrendously misfigured, that was very far from the elegant ideal of Greek classical period. So creatures with 100 eyes, with many limbs, with let's say the initial trial and errors of creation, be it divine or human, in this case divine, or just generally universal. So it deals with that particular layer, and this layer of existence, something that is heavily delegated to subconsciousness, and something that again you can see as eldritch horror. Really plays an important role in lowbrow, and you can see this to a certain extent present as inspiration not only in medieval illuminations and marginalia of illuminations. You can see it in let's say Henri Rousseau, the douanier Rousseau, custom officer Rousseau, and his inspiration and how he was very influential to initial surrealism. And then you can see people like Salvador Dali, I would argue unsuccessfully attempting to get to this particular context. This is just my take on it. I think he was too much of a snob and too much of an opportunist to actually fully embrace it. But when it comes to people like Mark Ryden, when it comes to people like, I would say Kenny Scharf, I wouldn't say Jason Freeney because it looks like a bit too informed, a bit too structured, what he does. But yeah, Robert Williams for sure. But yeah, Mark Ryden, he is, Mark Ryden. He really goes the furthest in this, I would argue, at least when I think of the artists that I'm familiar with in this particular movement. He really goes the furthest in this bringing together of childhood and weirdness and violence. He has the whole thing about meat, and he depicts meat in many different aspects, and this very peculiar, very weird universe where you have a childhood joy with this kind of horror lurking in the background or somehow sometimes being openly displayed in the foreground. It's a very interesting situation. So yeah, I see now that there's a lot that we didn't cover. I mean, I'm out of time. It's already been an hour, and obviously, this is something that's very dear to me. This is something I could talk about for a lot longer. There are a lot of things I didn't get to address. But yeah, some other time, I guess. So thank you for your attention. I hope to see you again soon, and I hope all of this made sense. So bye.